Chapter 5. The Golden Locket. The little British army in East Africa, after suffering severe reverses at the hands of a numerically much superior force, was at last coming into its own. The German offensive had been broken and the Huns were now slowly and doggedly retreating along the railway to Tanga. The break in the German lines had followed the clearing of a section of their left flank trenches of native soldiers by Tarzan and Numa, the lion, upon that memorable night that the ape-man had loosed a famishing man-eater among the superstitious and terror-stricken blacks. The 2nd Rhodesian Regiment had immediately taken possession of the abandoned trench, and from this position their flanking fire had raked contiguous sections of the German line, the diversion rendering possible a successful night attack on the part of the balance of the British forces. Weeks had elapsed. The Germans were contesting stubbornly every mile of waterless, thorn-covered ground and clinging desperately to their positions along the railway. The officers of the 2nd Rhodesians had seen nothing more of Tarzan of the Apes since he had slain under Lieutenant von Goss and disappeared toward the very heart of the German position, and there were those among them who believed that he had been killed within the enemy lines. They may have killed him, assented Colonel Capel, but I fancy they never captured the beggar alive. Nor had they, nor killed him either. Tarzan had spent those intervening weeks pleasantly and profitably. He had amassed a considerable fund of knowledge concerning the disposition and strength of German troops, their methods of warfare, and the various ways in which a lone Tarmangani might annoy an army and lower its morale. At present he was prompted by a specific desire. There was a certain German spy whom he wished to capture alive and take back to the British. When he had made his first visit to German headquarters, he had seen a young woman deliver a paper to the German general, and later he had seen that same young woman within the British lines in the uniform of a British officer. The conclusions were obvious: she was a spy. And so Tarzan haunted German headquarters upon many nights, hoping to see her again or to pick up some clue as to her whereabouts, and at the same time he utilized many an artifice whereby he might bring terror to the hearts of the Germans. That he was successful was often demonstrated by the snatches of conversation he overheard as he prowled through the German camps. One night, as he lay concealed in the bushes close beside a regimental headquarters, he listened to the conversation of several bush officers. One of the men reverted to the stories told by the native troops in connection with their rout by a lion several weeks before, and the simultaneous appearance in their trenches of a naked white giant whom they were perfectly assured was some demon of the jungle. The fellow must have been the same as he who leaped into the general's headquarters and carried off Schneider, asserted one. I wonder how he happened to single out the poor major. They say the creature seemed interested in no one but Schneider. He had von Kelter in his grasp, and he might easily have taken the general himself, but he ignored them all, except Schneider. Him he pursued about the room, seized and carried off into the night. God knows what his fate was. Captain Fritz Schneider has some sort of theory, said another. He told me only a week or two ago that he thinks he knows why his brother was taken, that it was a case of mistaken identity. He was not so sure about it until von Goss was killed, apparently by the same creature. The night the lion entered the trenches. Von Goss was attached to Schneider's company. One of Schneider's men was found with his neck wrung the same night that the major was carried off, and Schneider thinks that this devil is after him and his command, that it came for him that night and got his brother by mistake. He says Kraut told him that in presenting the major to Fräulein Kircher, the former's name was no sooner spoken than this wild man leaped through the window and made for him. Suddenly the little group became rigid, listening. What was that? Snapped one, eyeing the bushes from which a smothered snarl had issued as Tarzan of the Apes realized that through his mistake the perpetrator of the horrid crime at his bungalow still lived, that the murderer of his wife went yet unpunished. For a long minute the officers stood with tensed nerves, every eye riveted upon the bushes from whence the ominous sound had issued. Each recalled recent mysterious disappearances from the heart of camps as well as from lonely outguards. Each thought of the silent dead he had seen, slain almost within sight of their fellows by some unseen creature. They thought of the marks upon dead throats made by talons or by giant fingers, they could not tell which, and those upon shoulders and jugulars where powerful teeth had fastened, and they waited with drawn pistols. Once the bushes moved almost imperceptibly, and an instant later one of the officers, without warning, fired into them, but Tarzan of the Apes was not there. In the interval between the moving of the bushes and the firing of the shot he had melted into the night. 10 minutes later he was hovering on the outskirts of that part of camp where were bivouacked for the night the black soldiers of a native company commanded by one Hauptmann Fritz Schneider. The men were stretched upon the ground without tents, but there were tents pitched for the officers. Toward these Tarzan crept. It was slow and perilous work, as the Germans were now upon the alert for the uncanny foe that crept into their camps to take his toll by night. Yet the ape-man passed their sentinels, eluded the vigilance of the interior guard, and crept at last to the rear of the officers' line. Here he flattened himself against the ground close behind the nearest tent and listened. From within came the regular breathing of a sleeping man, one only. Tarzan was satisfied. With his knife he cut the tie strings of the rear flap and entered. He made no noise. The shadow of a falling leaf, floating gently to earth upon a still day, could have been no more soundless. He moved to the side of the sleeping man and bent low over him. He could not know, of course, whether it was Schneider or another, as he had never seen Schneider, but he meant to know, and to know even more. Gently he shook the man by the shoulder. The fellow turned heavily and grunted in a thick guttural. "Silence," admonished the ape-man in a low whisper. "Silence, I kill." The Hun opened his eyes. In the dim light he saw a giant figure bending over him. Now a mighty hand grasped his shoulder and another closed lightly about his throat. "Make no outcry," commanded Tarzan, "but answer in a whisper my questions. What is your name?" "Luberg," replied the officer. He was trembling. The weird presence of this naked giant filled him with dread. He, too, recalled the men mysteriously murdered in the still watches of the night camps. "What do you want?" "Where is Hauptmann Fritz Schneider?" asked Tarzan. "Which is his tent?" "He is not here," replied Luberg. "He was sent to Wilhelmstal yesterday." "I shall not kill you now," said the ape-man. "First I shall go and learn if you have lied to me, and if you have, your death shall be the more terrible. Do you know how Major Schneider died?" Luberg shook his head negatively. "I do," continued Tarzan, "and it was not a nice way to die even for an accursed German. Turn over with your face down and cover your eyes. Do not move or make any sound." The man did as he was bid, and the instant that his eyes were turned away, Tarzan slipped from the tent. An hour later he was outside the German camp and headed for the little hill town of Wilhelmstal, the summer seat of government of German East Africa. Fraulein Bertha Kircher was lost. She was humiliated and angry. It was long before she would admit it, that she, who prided herself upon her woodcraft, was lost in this little patch of country between the Pangani and the Tanga railway. She knew that Wilhelmstal lay southeast of her about 50 miles, but through a combination of untoward circumstances, she found herself unable to determine which was southeast. In the first place, she had set out from German headquarters on a well-marked road that was being traveled by troops, and with every reason to believe that she would follow that road to Wilhelmstal. Later she had been warned from this road by word that a strong British patrol had come down the west bank of the Pangani, effected a crossing south of her, and was even then marching on the railway at Tonda. After leaving the road she found herself in thick bush, and as the sky was heavily overcast she presently had recourse to her compass, and it was not until then that she discovered to her dismay that she did not have it with her. So sure was she of her woodcraft, however, that she continued on in the direction she thought west, until she had covered sufficient distance to warrant her in feeling assured that by now, turning south, she could pass safely in rear of the British patrol. Nor did she commence to feel any doubts until long after she had again turned toward the east, well south, as she thought, of the patrol. It was late afternoon. She should long since have struck the road again south of Tonda, but she had found no road, and now she began to feel real anxiety. Her horse had traveled all day without food or water. Night was approaching, and with it a realization that she was hopelessly lost in a wild and trackless country notorious principally for its sea-tsetse flies and savage beasts. It was maddening to know that she had absolutely no knowledge of the direction she was traveling, that she might be forging steadily further from the railway, deeper into the gloomy and forbidding country toward the Pangani, yet it was impossible to stop. She must go on. Bertha Kircher was no coward, whatever else she may have been. But as night began to close down around her, she could not shut out from her mind entirely contemplation of the terrors of the long hours ahead before the rising sun should dissipate the Stygian gloom, the horrid jungle night that lures forth all the prowling, preying creatures of destruction. She found, just before dark, an open meadow-like break in the almost interminable bush. There was a small clump of trees near the center, and here she decided to camp. The grass was high and thick, affording feed for her horse and a bed for herself, and there was more than enough dead wood lying about the trees to furnish a good fire well through the night. Removing the saddle and bridle from her mount, she placed them at the foot of a tree, and then picketed the animal close by. Then she busied herself collecting firewood, and by the time darkness had fallen she had a good fire and enough wood to last until morning. From her saddlebags she took cold food, and from her canteen a swallow of water. She could not afford more than a small swallow, for she could not know how long a time it might be before she should find more. It filled her with sorrow that her poor horse must go waterless, for even German spies may have hearts, and this one was very young and very feminine. It was now dark. There was neither moon nor stars, and the light from her fire only accentuated the blackness beyond. She could see the grass about her and the boles of the trees which stood out in brilliant relief against the solid background of impenetrable night, and beyond the firelight there was nothing. The jungle seemed ominously quiet. Far away in the distance she heard faintly the boom of big guns, but she could not locate their direction. She strained her ears until her nerves were on the point of breaking, but she could not tell from whence the sound came. And it meant so much to her to know, for the battle lines were north of her, and if she could but locate the direction of the firing she would know which way to go in the morning. In the morning. Would she live to see another morning? She squared her shoulders and shook herself together. Such thoughts must be banished, they would never do. Bravely she hummed an air as she arranged her saddle near the fire, and pulled a quantity of long grass to make a comfortable seat, over which she spread her saddle blanket. Then she strapped a heavy, military coat from the cantle of her saddle and donned it, for the air was already chill. Seating herself where she could lean against the saddle, she prepared to maintain a sleepless vigil throughout the night. For an hour the silence was broken only by the distant booming of the guns and the low noises of the feeding horse, and then, from possibly a mile away, came the rumbling thunder of a lion's roar. The girl started and laid her hand upon the rifle at her side. A little shudder ran through her slight frame, and she could feel the goose flesh rise upon her body. Again and again was the awful sound repeated, and each time she was certain that it came nearer. She could locate the direction of this sound, although she could not that of the guns, for the origin of the former was much closer. The lion was upwind, and so could not have caught her scent as yet, though he might be approaching to investigate the light of the fire, which could doubtless be seen for a considerable distance. For another fear-filled hour the girl sat straining her eyes and ears out into the black void beyond her little island of light. During all that time the lion did not roar again, but there was constantly the sensation that it was creeping upon her. Again and again she would start and turn to peer into the blackness beyond the trees behind her as her overwrought nerves conjured the stealthy fall of padded feet. She held the rifle across her knees at the ready now, and she was trembling from head to foot. Suddenly her horse raised his head and snorted, and with a little cry of terror the girl sprang to her feet. The animal turned and trotted back toward her, until the picket rope brought him to a stand, and then he wheeled about, and with ears up gazed out into the night, but the girl could neither see nor hear aught. Still another hour of terror passed, during which the horse often raised his head to peer long and searchingly into the dark. The girl replenished the fire from time to time. She found herself becoming very sleepy. Her heavy lids persisted in drooping, but she dared not sleep. Fearful lest she might be overcome by the drowsiness that was stealing through her, she rose and walked briskly to and fro. Then she threw some more wood on the fire, walked over and stroked her horse's muzzle, and returned to her seat. Leaning against the saddle she tried to occupy her mind with plans for the morrow, but she must have dozed. With a start she awoke. It was broad daylight. The hideous night with its indescribable terrors was gone. She could scarce believe the testimony of her senses. She had slept for hours, the fire was out, and yet she and the horse were safe and alive, nor was there sign of savage beast about. And best of all, the sun was shining, pointing the straight road to the east. Hastily she ate a few mouthfuls of her precious rations, which with a swallow of water constituted her breakfast. Then she saddled her horse and mounted. Already she felt that she was as good as safe in Wilhelmstal. Possibly, however, she might have revised her conclusions could she have seen the two pairs of eyes watching her every move intently from different points in the bush. Light-hearted and unsuspecting, the girl rode across the clearing toward the bush, while directly before her two yellow-green eyes glared round and terrible. A tawny tail twitched nervously, and great, padded paws gathered beneath a sleek barrel for a mighty spring. The horse was almost at the edge of the bush when Numa the lion launched himself through the air. He struck the animal's right shoulder at the instant that it reared, terrified, to wheel in flight. The force of the impact hurled the horse backward to the ground, and so quickly that the girl had no opportunity to extricate herself, but fell to the earth with her mount, her left leg pinned beneath its body. Horror-stricken, she saw the king of beasts open his mighty jaws and seize the screaming creature by the back of its neck. The great jaws closed. There was an instant struggle as Numa shook his prey. She could hear the vertebrae crack as the mighty fangs crunched through them, and then the muscles of her faithful friend relaxed in death. Numa crouched upon his kill. His terrifying eyes riveted themselves upon the girl's face. She could feel his hot breath upon her cheek, and the odor of the fetid vapor nauseated her. For what seemed an eternity to the girl, the two lay staring at each other, and then the lion uttered a menacing growl. Never before had Bertha Kircher been so terrified. Never before had she had such cause for terror. At her hip was a pistol, a formidable weapon with which to face a man, but a puny thing indeed with which to menace the great beast before her. She knew that at best it could but enrage him, and yet she meant to sell her life dearly, for she felt that she must die. No human succor could have availed her, even had it been there to offer itself. For a moment she tore her gaze from the hypnotic fascination of that awful face and breathed the last prayer to her God. She did not ask for aid, for she felt that she was beyond even divine succor. She only asked that the end might come quickly, and with as little pain as possible. No one can prophesy what a lion will do in any given emergency. This one glared and growled at the girl for a moment and then fell to feeding upon the dead horse. Fraulein Kircher wondered for an instant, and then attempted to draw her leg cautiously from beneath the body of her mount, but she could not budge it. She increased the force of her efforts, and Numa looked up from his feeding to growl again. The girl desisted. She hoped that he might satisfy his hunger and then depart to lie up, but she could not believe that he would leave her there alive. Doubtless he would drag the remains of his kill into the bush for hiding, and as there could be no doubt that he considered her part of his prey, he would certainly come back for her, or possibly drag her in first and kill her. Again Numa fell to feeding. The girl's nerves were at the breaking point. She wondered that she had not fainted under the strain of terror and shock. She recalled that she often had wished she might see a lion close to, make a kill and feed upon it. God, how realistically her wish had been granted. Again she bethought herself of her pistol. As she had fallen, the holster had slipped around so that the weapon now lay beneath her. Very slowly she reached for it, but in so doing she was forced to raise her body from the ground. Instantly the lion was aroused. With the swiftness of a cat, he reached across the carcass of the horse and placed a heavy, taloned paw upon her breast, crushing her back to earth, and all the time he growled and snarled horribly. His face was a picture of frightful rage incarnate. For a moment neither moved, and then from behind her the girl heard a human voice uttering bestial sounds. Numa suddenly looked up from the girl's face at the thing beyond her. His growls increased to roars as he drew back, ripping the front of the girl's waist almost from her body with his long talons, exposing her white bosom, which through some miracle of chance the great claws did not touch. Tarzan of the apes had witnessed the entire encounter from the moment that Numa had leaped upon his prey. For some time before he had been watching the girl, and after the lion attacked her he had at first been minded to let Numa have his way with her. What was she but a hated German and a spy besides? He had seen her at General Kraut's headquarters in conference with the German staff, and again he had seen her within the British lines masquerading as a British officer. It was the latter thought that prompted him to interfere. Doubtless General Jan Smuts would be glad to meet and question her. She might be forced to divulge information of value to the British commander before Smuts had her shot. Tarzan had recognized not only the girl but the lion as well. All lions may look alike to you and me, but not so to their intimates of the jungle. Each has his individual characteristics of face and form and gait as well defined as those that differentiate members of the human family, and besides these the creatures of the jungle have a still more positive test, that of scent. Each of us, man or beast, has his own peculiar odor, and it is mostly by this that the beasts of the jungle, endowed with miraculous powers of scent, recognize individuals. It is the final proof. You have seen it demonstrated 1,000 times. A dog recognizes your voice and looks at you. He knows your face and figure. Good, there can be no doubt in his mind but that it is you, but is he satisfied? No, sir, he must come up and smell of you. All his other senses may be fallible, but not his sense of smell, and so he makes assurance positive by the final test. Tarzan recognized Numa as he whom he had muzzled with the hide of Horta, the boar as he whom he handled by a rope for 2 days and finally loosed in a German front-line trench. And he knew that Numa would recognize him, that he would remember the sharp spear that had goaded him into submission and obedience, and Tarzan hoped that the lesson he had learned still remained with the lion. Now he came forward, calling to Numa in the language of the great apes, warning him away from the girl. It is open to question that Numa the lion understood him, but he did understand the menace of the heavy spear that the Tarmangani carried so ready in his brown right hand, and so he drew back, growling, trying to decide in his little brain whether to charge or flee. On came the ape-man with never a pause, straight for the lion. "Go away, Numa," he cried, "or Tarzan will tie you up again and lead you through the jungle without food. See a rod, my spear. Do you recall how his point stuck into you and how with his haft I beat you over the head? Go, Numa, I am Tarzan of the apes." Numa wrinkled the skin of his face into great folds, until his eyes almost disappeared, and he growled and roared and snarled and growled again, and when the spear point came at last quite close to him, he struck at it viciously with his armed paw, but he drew back. Tarzan stepped over the dead horse, and the girl lying behind him gazed in wide-eyed astonishment at the handsome figure driving an angry lion deliberately from its kill. When Numa had retreated a few yards, the ape-man called back to the girl in perfect German, "Are you badly hurt?" "I think not," she replied, "but I cannot extricate my foot from beneath my horse." "Try again," commanded Tarzan. "I do not know how long I can hold Numa thus." The girl struggled frantically, but at last she sank back upon an elbow. "It is impossible," she called to him. He backed slowly until he was again beside the horse, when he reached down and grasped the cinch, which was still intact. Then, with one hand, he raised the carcass from the ground. The girl freed herself and rose to her feet. "You can walk?" asked Tarzan. "Yes," she said, "my leg is numb, but it does not seem to be injured." "Good," commented the ape-man. "Back slowly away behind me, make no sudden movements. I think he will not charge." With utmost deliberation, the two backed toward the bush. Numa stood for a moment growling, then he followed them slowly. Tarzan wondered if he would come beyond his kill, or if he would stop there. If he followed them beyond, then they could look for a charge, and if Numa charged, it was very likely that he would get one of them. When the lion reached the carcass of the horse, Tarzan stopped, and so did Numa, as Tarzan had thought that he would, and the ape-man waited to see what the lion would do next. He eyed them for a moment, snarled angrily, and then looked down at the tempting meat. Presently he crouched upon his kill and resumed feeding. The girl breathed a deep sigh of relief as she and the ape-man resumed their slow retreat, with only an occasional glance from the lion, and when at last they reached the bush and had turned and entered it, she felt a sudden giddiness overwhelm her, so that she staggered and would have fallen had Tarzan not caught her. It was only a moment before she regained control of herself. "I could not help it," she said, in half apology. "I was so close to death, such a horrible death, it unnerved me for an instant, but I am all right now. How can I ever thank you? It was so wonderful. You did not seem to fear the frightful creature in the least, yet he was afraid of you. Who are you?" "He knows me," replied Tarzan grimly. "That is why he fears me." He was standing facing the girl now, and for the first time he had a chance to look at her squarely and closely. She was very beautiful, that was undeniable, but Tarzan realized her beauty only in a subconscious way. It was superficial, it did not color her soul, which must be black as sin. She was German, a German spy. He hated her and desired only to compass her destruction, but he would choose the manner so that it would work most grievously against the enemy cause. He saw her naked breasts where Numa had torn her clothing from her, and dangling there against the soft white flesh he saw that which brought a sudden scowl of surprise and anger to his face, the diamond-studded golden locket of his youth, the love token that had been stolen from the breast of his mate by Schneider the Hun. The girl saw the scowl but did not interpret it correctly. Tarzan grasped her roughly by the arm. "Where did you get this?" he demanded as he tore the bauble from her. The girl drew herself to her full height. "Take your hand from me," she demanded, but the ape-man paid no attention to her words, only seizing her more forcibly. "Answer me," he snapped. "Where did you get this?" "What is it to you?" she countered. "It is mine," he replied. "Tell me who gave it to you, or I will throw you back to Numa." "You would do that?" she asked. "Why not?" he queried. "You are a spy, and spies must die if they are caught." "You were going to kill me then?" "I was going to take you to headquarters. They would dispose of you there, but Numa can do it quite as effectively. Which do you prefer?" "Hauptmann Fritz Schneider gave it to me," she said. "Headquarters it will be then," said Tarzan. "Come." The girl moved at his side through the bush, and all the time her mind worked quickly. They were moving east, which suited her, and as long as they continued to move east, she was glad to have the protection of the great white savage. She speculated much upon the fact that her pistol still swung at her hip. The man must be mad not to take it from her. "What makes you think I am a spy?" she asked after a long silence. "I saw you at German headquarters," he replied, and then again inside the British lines. She could not let him take her back to them. She must reach Wilhelmstal at once, and she was determined to do so even if she must have recourse to her pistol. She cast a side glance at the tall figure. What a magnificent creature. But yet he was a brute who would kill her or have her killed if she did not slay him. And the locket. She must have that back. It must not fail to reach Wilhelmstal. Tarzan was now a foot or two ahead of her as the path was very narrow. Cautiously she drew her pistol. A single shot would suffice, and he was so close that she could not miss. As she figured it all out, her eyes rested on the brown skin with the graceful muscles rolling beneath it, and the perfect limbs and head and the carriage that a proud king of old might have envied. A wave of revulsion for her contemplated act surged through her. No, she could not do it yet. She must be free, and she must regain possession of the locket. And then, almost blindly, she swung the weapon up and struck Tarzan heavily upon the back of the head with its butt. Like a felled ox, he dropped in his tracks. Chapter 6. Vengeance and Mercy. It was an hour later that Sheeta, the panther hunting, chanced to glance upward into the blue sky, where his attention was attracted by Ska, the vulture, circling slowly above the bush a mile away and downwind. For a long minute the yellow eyes stared intently at the gruesome bird. They saw Ska dive and rise again to continue his ominous circling, and in these movements their woodcraft read that which, while obvious to Sheeta, would doubtless have meant nothing to you or me. The hunting cat guessed that on the ground beneath Ska was some living thing of flesh, either a beast feeding upon its kill, or a dying animal that Ska did not yet dare attack. In either event it might prove meat for Sheeta, and so the wary feline stalked by a circuitous route, upon soft, padded feet that gave forth no sound, until the circling Aasvogel and his intended prey were upwind. Then, sniffing each vagrant zephyr, Sheeta, the panther, crept cautiously forward, nor had he advanced any considerable distance before his keen nostrils were rewarded with the scent of Mana Tarmangani. Sheeta paused. He was not a hunter of men. He was young and in his prime, but always before he had avoided this hated presence. And of late he had become more accustomed to it with the passing of many soldiers through his ancient hunting ground, and as the soldiers had frightened away a great part of the game Sheeta had been wont to feed upon, the days had been lean, and Sheeta was hungry. The circling Ska suggested that this Tarmangani might be helpless and upon the point of dying, else Ska would not have been interested in him, and so easy prey for Sheeta. With this thought in mind, the cat resumed his stalking. Presently he pushed through the thick bush, and his yellow-green eyes rested gloatingly upon the body of an almost naked Tarmangani lying face down in a narrow game trail. Numa, sated, rose from the carcass of Bertha Kircher's horse and seized the partially devoured body by the neck and dragged it into the bush. Then he started east toward the lair where he had left his mate. Being uncomfortably full, he was inclined to be sleepy and far from belligerent. He moved slowly and majestically with no effort at silence or concealment. The king walked abroad unafraid. With an occasional regal glance to right or left, he moved along a narrow game trail until at a turn he came to a sudden stop at what lay revealed before him: Sheeta, the panther, creeping stealthily upon the almost naked body of a Tarmangani, lying face down in the deep dust of the pathway. Numa glared intently at the quiet body in the dust. Recognition came. It was his Tarmangani. A low growl of warning rumbled from his throat, and Sheeta halted with one paw upon Tarzan's back and turned suddenly to eye the intruder. What passed within those savage brains, who may say? The panther seemed debating the wisdom of defending his find, for he growled horribly as though warning Numa away from the prey, and Numa was the idea of property rights dominating his thoughts. The Tarmangani was his, or he was the Tarmangani's. Had not the great white ape mastered and subdued him, and too, had he not fed him? Numa recalled the fear that he had felt of this man-thing and his cruel spear, but in savage brains fear is more likely to engender respect than hatred, and so Numa found that he respected the creature who had subdued and mastered him. He saw Sheeta, upon whom he looked with contempt, daring to molest the master of the lion. Jealousy and greed alone might have been sufficient to prompt Numa to drive Sheeta away, even though the lion was not sufficiently hungry to devour the flesh that he thus wrested from the lesser cat. But then, too, there was in the little brain within the massive head a sense of loyalty. And perhaps this it was that sent Numa quickly forward, growling toward the spitting Sheeta. For a moment the latter stood his ground with arched back and snarling face, for all the world like a great, spotted tabby. Numa had not felt like fighting, but the sight of Sheeta daring to dispute his rights kindled his ferocious brain to sudden fire. His rounded eyes glared with rage, his undulating tail snapped to stiff erectness as with a frightful roar he charged this presuming vassal. It came so suddenly and from so short a distance that Sheeta had no chance to turn and flee the rush, and so he met it with raking talons and snapping jaws, but the odds were all against him. To the larger fangs and the more powerful jaws of his adversary were added huge talons and the preponderance of the lion's great weight. At the first clash Sheeta was crushed, and though he deliberately fell upon his back and drew up his powerful hind legs beneath Numa with the intention of disemboweling him, the lion forestalled him, and at the same time closed his awful jaws upon Sheeta's throat. It was soon over. Numa rose, shaking himself, and stood above the torn and mutilated body of his foe. His own sleek coat was cut and the red blood trickled down his flank, though it was but a minor injury. It angered him. He glared down at the dead panther and then, in a fit of rage, he seized and mauled the body only to drop it in a moment, lower his head, voice a single terrific roar, and turn toward the ape-man. Approaching the still form, he sniffed it over from head to foot. Then he placed a huge paw upon it and turned it over with its face up. Again he smelled about the body, and at last with his rough tongue licked Tarzan's face. It was then that Tarzan opened his eyes. Above him towered the huge lion, its hot breath upon his face, its rough tongue upon his cheek. The ape-man had often been close to death, but never before so close as this, he thought, for he was convinced that death was but a matter of seconds. His brain was still numb from the effects of the blow that had felled him, and so he did not, for a moment, recognize the lion that stood over him as the one he had so recently encountered. Presently, however, recognition dawned upon him, and with it a realization of the astounding fact that Numa did not seem bent on devouring him, at least not immediately. His position was a delicate one. The lion stood astraddle Tarzan with his front paws. The ape-man could not rise, therefore, without pushing the lion away, and whether Numa would tolerate being pushed was an open question. 2. The beast might consider him already dead, and any movement that indicated the contrary was true would, in all likelihood, arouse the killing instinct of the man-eater. But Tarzan was tiring of the situation. He was in no mood to lie there forever, especially when he contemplated the fact that the girl spy who had tried to brain him was undoubtedly escaping as rapidly as possible. Numa was looking right into his eyes now, evidently aware that he was alive. Presently the lion cocked his head on one side and whined. Tarzan knew the note, and he knew that it spelled neither rage nor hunger, and then he risked all on a single throw, encouraged by that low whine. Move, Numa, he commanded, and placing a palm against the tawny shoulder he pushed the lion aside. Then he rose and with a hand on his hunting knife awaited that which might follow. It was then that his eyes fell for the first time on the torn body of Sheeta. He looked from the dead cat to the live one and saw the marks of conflict upon the latter, too, and in an instant realized something of what had happened. Numa had saved him from the panther. It seemed incredible, and yet the evidence pointed clearly to the fact. He turned toward the lion and without fear approached and examined his wounds, which he found superficial, and as Tarzan knelt beside him, Numa rubbed an itching ear against the naked brown shoulder. Then the ape-man stroked the great head, picked up his spear, and looked about for the trail of the girl. This he soon found leading toward the east, and as he set out upon it, something prompted him to feel for the locket he had hung about his neck. It was gone. No trace of anger was apparent upon the ape-man's face unless it was a slight tightening of the jaws, but he put his hand ruefully to the back of his head where a bump marked the place where the girl had struck him, and a moment later a half-smile played across his lips. He could not help but admit that she had tricked him neatly, and that it must have taken nerve to do the thing she did and to set out armed only with a pistol through the trackless waste that lay between them and the railway and beyond into the hills where Wilhelm still lies. Tarzan admired courage. He was big enough to admit it and admire it even in a German spy, but he saw that in this case it only added to her resourcefulness and made her all the more dangerous, and the necessity for putting her out of the way paramount. He hoped to overtake her before she reached Wilhelmstal, and so he set out at the swinging trot that he could hold for hours at a stretch without apparent fatigue. That the girl could hope to reach the town on foot in less than 2 days seemed improbable, for it was a good 30 miles and part of it hilly. Even as the thought crossed his mind, he heard the whistle of a locomotive to the east and knew that the railway was in operation again after a shutdown of several days. If the train was going south, the girl would signal it if she had reached the right-of-way. His keen ears caught the whining of brake shoes on wheels, and a few minutes later the signal blast for brakes off. The train had stopped and started again, and as it gained headway and greater distance, Tarzan could tell from the direction of the sound that it was moving south. The ape-man followed the trail to the railway, where it ended abruptly on the west side of the track, showing that the girl had boarded the train, just as he thought. There was nothing now but to follow on to Wilhelmstal, where he hoped to find Captain Fritz Schneider as well as the girl, and to recover his diamond-studded locket. It was dark when Tarzan reached the little hill town of Wilhelmstal. He loitered on the outskirts, getting his bearings and trying to determine how an almost naked white man might explore the village without arousing suspicion. There were many soldiers about, and the town was under guard, for he could see a lone sentinel walking his post scarce 100 yards from him. To elude this one would not be difficult, but to enter the village and search it would be practically impossible, garbed or ungarbed as he was. Creeping forward, taking advantage of every cover, lying flat and motionless when the sentry's face was toward him, the ape-man at last reached the sheltering shadows of an outhouse just inside the lines. From there he moved stealthily from building to building until at last he was discovered by a large dog in the rear of one of the bungalows. The brute came slowly toward him, growling. Tarzan stood motionless beside a tree. He could see a light in the bungalow and uniformed men moving about, and he hoped that the dog would not bark. He did not, but he growled more savagely, and just at the moment that the rear door of the bungalow opened and a man stepped out, the animal charged. He was a large dog, as large as Dango the hyena, and he charged with all the vicious impetuosity of Numa the lion. As he came, Tarzan knelt and the dog shot through the air for his throat, but he was dealing with no man now, and he found his quickness more than matched by the quickness of the Tarmangani. His teeth never reached the soft flesh, strong fingers of steel, seized his neck. He voiced a single startled yelp and clawed at the naked breast before him with his talons, but he was powerless. The mighty fingers closed upon his throat. The man rose, snapped the clawing body once, and cast it aside. At the same time, a voice from the open bungalow door called Simba. There was no response. Repeating the call, the man descended the steps and advanced toward the tree. In the light from the doorway, Tarzan could see that he was a tall, broad-shouldered man in the uniform of a German officer. The ape-man withdrew into the shadow of the tree's stem. The man came closer, still calling the dog. He did not see the savage beast, crouching now in the shadow awaiting him. When he had approached within 10 feet of the Tarmangani, Tarzan leaped upon him as saber springs to the kill, so sprang the ape-man. The momentum and weight of his body hurled the German to the ground. Powerful fingers prevented an outcry, and though the officer struggled, he had no chance, and a moment later lay dead beside the body of the dog. As Tarzan stood for a moment looking down upon his kill and regretting that he could not risk voicing his beloved victory cry, the sight of the uniform suggested a means whereby he might pass to and fro through Wilhelmstal with the minimum chance of detection. 10 minutes later, a tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped from the yard of the bungalow, leaving behind him the corpses of a dog and a naked man. He walked boldly along the little street, and those who passed him could not guess that beneath Imperial Germany's uniform beat a savage heart that pulsed with implacable hatred for the Hun. Tarzan's first concern was to locate the hotel, for here he guessed he would find the girl, and where the girl was doubtless would be Hauptmann Fritz Schneider, who was either her confederate, her sweetheart, or both, and there, too, would be Tarzan's precious locket. He found the hotel at last, a low, 2-storied building with a veranda. There were lights on both floors, and people, mostly officers, could be seen within. The ape-man considered entering and inquiring for those he sought, but his better judgment finally prompted him to reconnoiter first. Passing around the building, he looked into all the lighted rooms on the first floor, and seeing neither of those for whom he had come, he swung lightly to the roof of the veranda and continued his investigations through windows of the second story. At one corner of the hotel, in a rear room, the blinds were drawn, but he heard voices within, and once he saw a figure silhouetted momentarily against the blind. It appeared to be the figure of a woman, but it was gone so quickly that he could not be sure. Tarzan crept close to the window and listened. Yes, there was a woman there, and a man. He heard distinctly the tones of their voices, although he could overhear no words, as they seemed to be whispering. The adjoining room was dark. Tarzan tried the window and found it unlatched. All was quiet within. He raised the sash and listened again, still silence. Placing a leg over the sill, he slipped within and hurriedly glanced about. The room was vacant. Crossing to the door, he opened it and looked out into the hall. There was no one there either, and he stepped out and approached the door of the adjoining room where the man and woman were. Pressing close to the door, he listened. Now he distinguished words, for the two had raised their voices as though in argument. The woman was speaking. "I have brought the locket," she said, "as was agreed upon between you and General Kraut, as my identification. I carry no other credentials. This was to be enough. You have nothing to do but give me the papers and let me go." The man replied in so low a tone that Tarzan could not catch the words, and then the woman spoke again, a note of scorn and perhaps a little of fear in her voice. "You would not dare, Hauptmann Schneider," she said, "and then do not touch me. Take your hands from me." It was then that Tarzan of the Apes opened the door and stepped into the room. What he saw was a huge bull-necked German officer with one arm about the waist of Fräulein Bertha Kircher and a hand upon her forehead, pushing her head back as he tried to kiss her on the mouth. The girl was struggling against the great brute, but her efforts were futile. Slowly the man's lips were coming closer to hers, and slowly, step by step, she was being carried backward. Schneider heard the noise of the opening and closing door behind him and turned. At sight of this strange officer, he dropped the girl and straightened up. "What is the meaning of this intrusion, Lieutenant?" he demanded, noting the other's epaulettes. "Leave the room at once." Tarzan made no articulate reply. But the two there with him heard a low growl break from those firm lips, a growl that sent a shudder through the frame of the girl and brought a pallor to the red face of the Hun, and his hand to his pistol. But even as he drew his weapon, it was wrested from him and hurled through the blind and window to the yard beyond. Then Tarzan backed against the door and slowly removed the uniform coat. "You are Hauptmann Schneider," he said to the German. "What of it?" growled the latter. "I am Tarzan of the Apes," replied the ape man. "Now you know why I intrude." The two before him saw that he was naked beneath the coat, which he threw upon the floor, and then he slipped quickly from the trousers and stood there clothed only in his loincloth. The girl had recognized him by this time too. "Take your hand off that pistol," Tarzan admonished her. Her hand dropped at her side. "Now come here." She approached, and Tarzan removed the weapon and hurled it after the other. At the mention of his name, Tarzan had noted the sickly pallor that overspread the features of the Hun. At last he had found the right man. At last his mate would be partially avenged. Never could she be entirely avenged. Life was too short, and there were too many Germans. "What do you want of me?" demanded Schneider. "You are going to pay the price for the thing you did at the little bungalow in the Waziri country," replied the ape man. Schneider commenced to bluster and threaten. Tarzan turned the key in the lock of the door and hurled the former through the window after the pistols. Then he turned to the girl. "Keep out of the way," he said in a low voice. "Tarzan of the Apes is going to kill." The Hun ceased blustering and began to plead. "I have a wife and children at home," he cried. "I have done nothing. "You are going to die as befits your kind," said Tarzan. With blood on your hands and a lie on your lips, he started across the room toward the burly Hauptmann. Schneider was a large and powerful man, about the height of the ape man, but much heavier. He saw that neither threats nor pleas would avail him, and so he prepared to fight as a cornered rat fights for its life, with all the maniacal rage, cunning and ferocity that the first law of nature imparts to many beasts. Lowering his bull head, he charged for the ape man, and in the center of the floor the two clinched. There they stood locked and swaying for a moment, until Tarzan succeeded in forcing his antagonist backward over a table, which crashed to the floor, splintered by the weight of the two heavy bodies. The girl stood watching the battle with wide eyes. She saw the two men rolling hither and thither across the floor, and she heard with horror the low growls that came from the lips of the naked giant. Schneider was trying to reach his foe's throat with his fingers, while, horror of horrors, Bertha Kircher could see that the other was searching for the German's jugular with his teeth. Schneider seemed to realize this too, for he redoubled his efforts to escape and finally succeeded in rolling over on top of the ape man and breaking away. Leaping to his feet, he ran for the window, but the ape man was too quick for him, and before he could leap through the sash, a heavy hand fell upon his shoulder and he was jerked back and hurled across the room to the opposite wall. There Tarzan followed him, and once again they locked, dealing each other terrific blows, until Schneider in a piercing voice screamed, "Comrade, comrade, comrade." Tarzan grasped the man by the throat and drew his hunting knife. Schneider's back was against the wall, so that though his knees wobbled, he was held erect by the ape man. Tarzan brought the sharp point to the lower part of the German's abdomen. "Thus you slew my mate," he hissed in a terrible voice. "Thus shall you die." The girl staggered forward. "Oh, God, no, she cried, not that. You are too brave, you cannot be such a beast as that. Tarzan turned at her. No, he said, you are right, I cannot do it, I am no German, and he raised the point of his blade and sunk it deep into the putrid heart of Hauptmann Fritz Schneider, putting a bloody period to the Hun's last gasping cry, I did not do it. She is not. Then Tarzan turned toward the girl and held out his hand. Give me my locket, he said. She pointed toward the dead officer. He has it. Tarzan searched him and found the trinket. Now you may give me the papers, he said to the girl, and without a word she handed him a folded document. For a long time he stood looking at her before Ho spoke again. I came for you too, he said. It would be difficult to take you back from here, and so I was going to kill you, as I have sworn to kill all your kind, but you were right when you said that I was not such a beast as that slayer of women. I could not slay him as he slew mine, nor can I slay you, who are a woman. He crossed to the window, raised the sash, and an instant later he had stepped out and disappeared into the night. And then Fräulein Bertha Kircher stepped quickly to the corpse upon the floor, slipped her hand inside the blouse and drew forth a little sheaf of papers which she tucked into her waist before she went to the window, and called for help. Chapter 7. When Blood Told. Tarzan of the Apes was disgusted. He had had the German spy Bertha Kircher in his power and had left her unscathed. It is true that he had slain Hauptmann Fritz Schneider, that Underlieutenant von Goss had died at his hands, and that he had otherwise wreaked vengeance upon the men of the German company who had murdered, pillaged, and raped at Tarzan's bungalow in the Waziri country. There was still another officer to be accounted for, but him he could not find. It was Lieutenant Obergatz he still sought, though vainly, for at last he learned that the man had been sent upon some special mission. Whether in Africa or back to Europe, Tarzan's informant either did not know or would not divulge. But the fact that he had permitted sentiment to stay his hand when he might so easily have put Bertha Kircher out of the way in the hotel at Wilhelmsthal that night rankled in the ape-man's bosom. He was shamed by his weakness, and when he had handed the paper she had given him to the British Chief of Staff, even though the information it contained permitted the British to frustrate a German flank attack, he was still much dissatisfied with himself. And possibly the root of this dissatisfaction lay in the fact that he realized that were he again to have the same opportunity, he would still find it as impossible to slay a woman as it had been in Wilhelmsthal that night. Tarzan blamed this weakness, as he considered it, upon his association with the effeminizing influences of civilization, for in the bottom of his savage heart he held in contempt both civilization and its representatives, the men and women of the civilized countries of the world. Always was he comparing their weaknesses, their vices, their hypocrisies, and their little vanities with the open, primitive ways of his ferocious jungle mates. And all the while there battled in that same big heart with these forces another mighty force, Tarzan's love and loyalty for his friends of the civilized world. The ape-man, reared as he had been by savage beasts amid savage beasts, was slow to make friends. Acquaintances he numbered by the hundreds, but of friends he had few. These few he would have died for, as doubtless they would have died for him, but there were none of these fighting with the British forces in East Africa, and so, sickened and disgusted by the sight of man waging his cruel and inhuman warfare, Tarzan determined to heed the insistent call of the remote jungle of his youth, for the Germans were now on the run and the war in East Africa was so nearly over that he realized that his further services would be of negligible value. Never regularly sworn into the service of the king, he was under no obligation to remain now that the moral obligation had been removed, and so it was that he disappeared from the British camp as mysteriously as he had appeared a few months before. More than once had Tarzan reverted to the primitive only to return again to civilization through love for his mate, but now that she was gone he felt that this time he had definitely departed forever from the haunts of man, and that he should live and die a beast among beasts even as he had been from infancy to maturity. Between him and his destination lay a trackless wilderness of untouched primeval savagery where, doubtless in many spots, his would be the first human foot to touch the virgin turf. Nor did this prospect dismay the Tamangani, rather was it an urge and an inducement, for rich in his veins flowed that noble strain of blood that has made most of the earth's surface habitable for man. The question of food and water that would have risen paramount in the mind of an ordinary man contemplating such an excursion gave Tarzan little concern. The wilderness was his natural habitat, and woodcraft as inherent to him as breathing. Unlike other jungle animals, he could scent water from a great distance, and where you or I might die of thirst, the ape-man would unerringly select the exact spot at which to dig and find water. For several days, Tarzan traversed a country rich in game and watercourses. He moved slowly, hunting and fishing, or again fraternizing or quarreling with the other savage denizens of the jungle. Now it was little Manu, the monkey, who chattered and scolded at the mighty Tarmangani, and in the next breath warned him that Hista, the snake, lay coiled in the long grass just ahead. Of Manu, Tarzan inquired concerning the great apes the Mangani, and was told that few inhabited this part of the jungle, and that even these were hunting farther to the north this season of the year. "But there is Bolgani," said Manu. "Would you like to see Bolgani?" Manu's tone was sneering, and Tarzan knew that it was because little Manu thought all creatures feared mighty Bolgani, the gorilla. Tarzan arched his great chest and struck it with a clenched fist. "I am Tarzan," he cried. While Tarzan was yet a Balu, he slew a Bolgani. Tarzan seeks the Mangani, who are his brothers, but Bolgani he does not seek, so let Bolgani keep from the path of Tarzan. Little Manu, the monkey, was much impressed, for the way of the jungle is to boast and to believe. It was then that he condescended to tell Tarzan more of the Mangani. "They go there and there and there," he said, making a wide sweep with a brown hand first toward the north, then west, and then south again. "For there," and he pointed due west, "is much hunting, but between lies a great place where there is no food and no water, so they must go that way." And again he swung his hand through the half-circle that explained to Tarzan the great detour the apes made to come to their hunting ground to the west. That was all right for the Mangani, who are lazy and do not care to move rapidly, but for Tarzan the straight road would be the best. He would cross the dry country and come to the good hunting in a third of the time that it would take to go far to the north and circle back again. And so it was that he continued on toward the west, and crossing a range of low mountains came in sight of a broad plateau, rock-strewn and desolate. Far in the distance he saw another range of mountains, beyond which he felt must lie the hunting ground of the Mangani. There he would join them and remain for a while before continuing on toward the coast and the little cabin that his father had built beside the landlocked harbor at the jungle's edge. Tarzan was full of plans. He would rebuild and enlarge the cabin of his birth, constructing storage houses where he would make the apes lay away food when it was plenty against the times that were lean, a thing no ape ever had dreamed of doing. And the tribe would remain always in the locality, and he would be king again as he had in the past. He would try to teach them some of the better things that he had learned from man, yet knowing the ape mind as only Tarzan could, he feared that his labors would be for naught. The ape man found the country he was crossing rough in the extreme, the roughest he ever had encountered. The plateau was cut by frequent canyons, the passage of which often entailed hours of wearing effort. The vegetation was sparse and of a faded brown color that lent to the whole landscape a most depressing aspect. Great rocks were strewn in every direction as far as the eye could see, lying partially embedded in an impalpable dust that rose in clouds about him at every step. The sun beat down mercilessly out of a cloudless sky. For a day Tarzan toiled across this now hateful land, and at the going down of the sun the distant mountains to the west seemed no nearer than at morn. Never a sign of living thing had the ape-man seen other than Ska, that bird of ill omen, that had followed him tirelessly since he had entered this parched waste. No littlest beetle that he might eat had given evidence that life of any sort existed here, and it was a hungry and thirsty Tarzan who lay down to rest in the evening. He decided now to push on during the cool of the night, for he realized that even mighty Tarzan had his limitations, and that where there was no food one could not eat, and where there was no water the greatest woodcraft in the world could find none. It was a totally new experience to Tarzan to find so barren and terrible a country in his beloved Africa. Even the Sahara had its oases, but this frightful world gave no indication of containing a square foot of hospitable ground. However, he had no misgivings but that he would fare forth into the wonder country of which little Manu had told him, though it was certain that he would do it with a dry skin and an empty belly, and so he fought on until daylight, when he again felt the need of rest. He was at the edge of another of those terrible canyons, the 8th he had crossed, whose precipitous sides would have taxed to the uttermost the strength of an untired man well fortified by food and water, and for the first time, as he looked down into the abyss, and then at the opposite side that he must scale, misgivings began to assail his mind. He did not fear death. With the memory of his murdered mate still fresh in his mind, he almost courted it, yet strong within him was that primal instinct of self-preservation, the battling force of life that would keep him an active contender against the great Reaper until, fighting to the very last, he should be overcome by a superior power. A shadow swung slowly across the ground beside him, and looking up, the ape-man saw Ska. the vulture, wheeling a wide circle above him. The grim and persistent harbinger of evil aroused the man to renewed determination. He arose and approached the edge of the canyon, and then, wheeling, with his face turned upward toward the circling bird of prey, he bellowed forth the challenge of the bull ape. "I am Tarzan," he shouted, "Lord of the jungle. Tarzan of the apes is not for Ska, eater of carrion. Go back to the lair of Dango and feed off the leavings of the hyenas, for Tarzan will leave no bones for Ska to pick in this empty wilderness of death." But before he reached the bottom of the canyon, he again was forced to the realization that his great strength was waning, and when he dropped exhausted at the foot of the cliff, and saw before him the opposite wall that must be scaled, he bared his fighting fangs and growled. For an hour he lay resting in the cool shade at the foot of the cliff. All about him reigned utter silence, the silence of the tomb. No fluttering birds, no humming insects, no scurrying reptiles relieved the death-like stillness. This indeed was the Valley of Death. He felt the depressing influence of the horrible place settling down upon him, but he staggered to his feet, shaking himself like a great lion. For was he not still Tarzan, mighty Tarzan of the apes? Yes, and Tarzan the mighty he would be until the last throb of that savage heart. As he crossed the floor of the canyon, he saw something lying close to the base of the sidewall. He was approaching something that stood out in startling contrast to all the surroundings, and yet seemed so much a part and parcel of the somber scene as to suggest an actor amid the settings of a well-appointed stage, and, as though to carry out the allegory, the pitiless rays of flaming kudu topped the eastern cliff, picking out the thing lying at the foot of the western wall like a giant spotlight. And as Tarzan came nearer, he saw the bleached skull and bones of a human being, about which were remnants of clothing and articles of equipment that, as he examined them, filled the ape-man with curiosity to such an extent that for a time he forgot his own predicament in contemplation of the remarkable story suggested by these mute evidences of a tragedy of a time long past. The bones were in a fair state of preservation and indicated by their intactness that the flesh had probably been picked from them by vultures, as none was broken, but the pieces of equipment bore out the suggestion of their great age. In this protected spot, where there were no frosts and evidently but little rainfall, the bones might have lain for ages without disintegrating, for there were here no other forces to scatter or disturb them. Near the skeleton lay a helmet of hammered brass, and a corroded breastplate of steel, while at one side was a long, straight sword in its scabbard and an ancient harquebus. The bones were those of a large man, a man of wondrous strength and vitality. Tarzan knew he must have been to have penetrated thus far through the dangers of Africa with such a ponderous yet at the same time futile armament. The ape-man felt a sense of deep admiration for this nameless adventurer of a bygone day. What a brute of a man he must have been, and what a glorious tale of battle and kaleidoscopic vicissitudes of fortune must once have been locked within that whitened skull. Tarzan stooped to examine the shreds of clothing that still lay about the bones. Every particle of leather had disappeared, doubtless eaten by Ska. No boots remained, if the man had worn boots, but there were several buckles scattered about, suggesting that a great part of his trappings had been of leather, while just beneath the bones of one hand lay a metal cylinder about 8 inches long and 2 inches in diameter. As Tarzan picked it up, he saw that it had been heavily lacquered and had withstood the slight ravages of time so well as to be in as perfect a state of preservation today as it had been when its owner dropped into his last, long sleep perhaps centuries ago. As he examined it, he discovered that one end was closed with a friction cover which a little twisting force soon loosened and removed, revealing within a roll of parchment which the ape-man removed and opened, disclosing a number of age-yellowed sheets closely written upon in a fine hand in a language which he guessed to be Spanish but which he could not decipher. Upon the last sheet was a roughly drawn map with numerous reference points marked upon it, all unintelligible to Tarzan, who, after a brief examination of the papers, returned them to their metal case, replaced the top, and was about to toss the little cylinder to the ground beside the mute remains of its former possessor, when some whim of curiosity unsatisfied prompted him to slip it into the quiver with his arrows. Though as he did so it was with the grim thought that possibly centuries hence it might again come to the sight of man beside his own bleached bones. And then, with a parting glance at the ancient skeleton, he turned to the task of ascending the western wall of the canyon. Slowly and with many rests he dragged his weakening body upwards. Again and again he slipped back from sheer exhaustion and would have fallen to the floor of the canyon but for merest chance. How long it took him to scale that frightful wall he could not have told, and when at last he dragged himself over the top, it was to lie weak and gasping, too spent to rise or even to move a few inches farther from the perilous edge of the chasm. At last he arose, very slowly and with evident effort, gaining his knees first and then staggering to his feet. Yet his indomitable will was evidenced by a sudden straightening of his shoulders and a determined shake of his head as he lurched forward on unsteady legs to take up his valiant fight for survival. Ahead he scanned the rough landscape for sign of another canyon which he knew would spell inevitable doom. The western hills rose closer now, though weirdly unreal, as they seemed to dance in the sunlight, as though mocking him with their nearness at the moment that exhaustion was about to render them forever unattainable. Beyond them he knew must be the fertile hunting grounds of which Manu had told. Even if no canyon intervened, his chances of surmounting even low hills seemed remote should he have the fortune to reach their base, but with another canyon hope was dead. Above them Ska still circled, and it seemed to the ape-man that the ill-omened bird hovered ever lower and lower as though reading in that failing gait the nearing of the end, and through cracked lips Tarzan growled out his defiance. Mile after mile Tarzan of the apes put slowly behind him, borne up by sheer force of will, where a lesser man would have lain down to die and rest forever tired muscles whose every move was an agony of effort. But at last his progress became practically mechanical. He staggered on with a dazed mind that reacted numbly to a single urge on. The hills were now but a dim, ill-defined blur ahead. Sometimes he forgot that they were hills, and again he wondered vaguely why he must go on forever through all this torture endeavoring to overtake them, the fleeing, elusive hills. Presently he began to hate them, and there formed within his half-delirious brain the hallucination that the hills were German hills, that they had slain someone dear to him, whom he could never quite recall, and that he was pursuing to slay them. This idea, growing, appeared to give him strength, a new and revivifying purpose, so that for a time he no longer staggered but went forward steadily with head erect. Once he stumbled and fell, and when he tried to rise he found that he could not, that his strength was so far gone that he could only crawl forward on his hands and knees for a few yards and then sink down again to rest. It was during one of these frequent periods of utter exhaustion that he heard the flap of dismal wings close above him. With his remaining strength he turned himself over on his back to see Ska wheel quickly upward. With the sight Tarzan's mind cleared for a while. Is the end so near as that, he thought? Does Ska know that I am so near gone that he dares come down and perch upon my carcass? And even then, a grim smile touched those swollen lips, as into the savage mind came a sudden thought, the cunning of the wild beast at bay. Closing his eyes, he threw a forearm across them to protect them from Ska's powerful beak, and then he lay very still and waited. It was restful lying there, for the sun was now obscured by clouds and Tarzan was very tired. He feared that he might sleep, and something told him that if he did he would never awaken, and so he concentrated all his remaining powers upon the one thought of remaining awake. Not a muscle moved to Ska. Circling above, it became evident that the end had come, that at last he should be rewarded for his long vigil. Circling slowly, he dropped closer and closer to the dying man. Why did not Tarzan move? Had he indeed been overcome by the sleep of exhaustion, or was Ska right? Had death at last claimed that mighty body? Was that great, savage heart stilled forever? It is unthinkable. Ska, filled with suspicions, circled warily. Twice he almost alighted upon the great, naked breast, only to wheel suddenly away, but the third time his talons touched the brown skin. It was as though the contact closed an electric circuit that instantaneously vitalized the quiet clod that had lain motionless so long. A brown hand swept downward from the brown forehead, and before Ska could raise a wing in flight, he was in the clutches of his intended victim. Ska fought, but he was no match for even a dying Tarzan, and a moment later the ape-man's teeth closed upon the carrion eater. The flesh was coarse and tough and gave off an unpleasant odor and a worse taste, but it was food and the blood was drink, and Tarzan only an ape at heart, and a dying ape, into the bargain dying of starvation and thirst. Even mentally weakened as he was, the ape-man was still master of his appetite, and so he ate but sparingly, saving the rest, and then, feeling that he now could do so safely, he turned upon his side and slept. Brain, beating heavily upon his body, awakened him, and sitting up he cupped his hands and caught the precious drops which he transferred to his parched throat. Only a little he got at a time, but that was best. The few mouthfuls of Ska that he had eaten, together with the blood and rain water and the sleep, had refreshed him greatly and put new strength into his tired muscles. Now he could see the hills again, and they were close, and though there was no sun, the world looked bright and cheerful, for Tarzan knew that he was saved. The bird that would have devoured him, and the providential rain, had saved him at the very moment that death seemed inevitable. Again, partaking of a few mouthfuls of the unsavory flesh of Ska, the vulture, the ape-man arose with something of his old force, and set out with steady gait toward the hills of promise rising alluringly ahead. Darkness fell before he reached them, but he kept on until he felt the steeply rising ground that proclaimed his arrival at the base of the hills proper, and then he lay down and waited until morning should reveal the easiest passage to the land beyond. The rain had ceased, but the sky still was overcast so that even his keen eyes could not penetrate the darkness farther than a few feet. And there he slept, after eating again of what remained of Ska, until the morning sun awakened him with a new sense of strength and well-being. And so at last he came through the hills out of the valley of death into a land of park-like beauty, rich in game. Below him lay a deep valley through the center of which dense jungle vegetation marked the course of a river beyond which a primeval forest extended for miles to terminate at last at the foot of lofty snow-capped mountains. It was a land that Tarzan never had looked upon before, nor was it likely that the foot of another white man ever had touched it unless, possibly in some long-gone day, the adventurer whose skeleton he had found bleaching in the canyon had traversed it. Chapter 8. Tarzan and the Great Apes. 3 days the ape-man spent in resting and recuperating, eating fruits and nuts and the smaller animals that were most easily bagged, and upon the 4th he set out to explore the valley and search for the great apes. Time was a negligible factor in the equation of life. It was all the same to Tarzan if he reached the west coast in a month or a year or 3 years. All time was his and all Africa. His was absolute freedom. The last tie that had bound him to civilization and custom had been severed. He was alone, but he was not exactly lonely. The greater part of his life had been spent thus, and though there was no other of his kind, he was at all times surrounded by the jungle peoples for whom familiarity had bred no contempt within his breast. The least of them interested him, and too there were those with whom he always made friends easily, and there were his hereditary enemies whose presence gave a spice to life that might otherwise have become humdrum and monotonous. And so it was that on the 4th day he set out to explore the valley and search for his fellow apes. He had proceeded southward for a short distance when his nostrils were assailed by the scent of man, of Gomangani, the black man. There were many of them, and mixed with their scent was another, that of a Shitarmangani. Swinging through the trees, Tarzan approached the authors of these disturbing scents. He came warily from the flank, but paying no attention to the wind, for he knew that man with his dull senses could apprehend him only through his eyes or ears, and then only when comparatively close. Had he been stalking Numa or Sheeta, he would have circled about until his quarry was upwind from him, thus taking practically all the advantage up to the very moment that he came within sight or hearing. But in the stalking of the dull-clawed man, he approached with almost contemptuous indifference, so that all the jungle about him knew that he was passing all but the men he stalked. From the dense foliage of a great tree he watched them pass, a disreputable mob of blacks, some garbed in the uniform of German East African native troops, others wearing a single garment of the same uniform, while many had reverted to the simple dress of their forebears, approximating nudity. There were many black women with them, laughing and talking as they kept pace with the men, all of whom were armed with German rifles and equipped with German belts and ammunition. There were no white officers there, but it was none the less apparent to Tarzan that these men were from some German native command, and he guessed that they had slain their officers and taken to the jungle with their women, or had stolen some from native villages through which they must have passed. It was evident that they were putting as much ground between themselves and the coast as possible, and doubtless were seeking some impenetrable fastness of the vast interior, where they might inaugurate a reign of terror among the primitively armed inhabitants, and by raiding, looting, and rape grow rich in goods and women at the expense of the district upon which they settled themselves. Between 2 of the black women marched a slender white girl. She was hatless, and with torn and disheveled clothing that had evidently once been a trim riding habit. Her coat was gone and her waist half torn from her body. Occasionally, and without apparent provocation, one or the other of the negresses struck or pushed her roughly. Tarzan watched through half-closed eyes. His first impulse was to leap among them and bear the girl from their cruel clutches. He had recognized her immediately, and it was because of this fact that he hesitated. What was it to Tarzan of the apes what fate befell this enemy spy? He had been unable to kill her himself because of an inherent weakness that would not permit him to lay hands upon a woman, all of which of course had no bearing upon what others might do to her. That her fate would now be infinitely more horrible than the quick and painless death that the ape-man would have meted to her only interested Tarzan to the extent that the more frightful the end of a German, the more in keeping it would be with what they all deserved. And so he let the blacks pass with Fraulein Bertha Kircher in their midst, or at least until the last straggling warrior suggested to his mind the pleasures of black baiting and amusement, and a sport in which he had grown ever more proficient since that long-gone day when Kulonga, the son of Mbonga, the chief, had cast his unfortunate spear at Kala, the ape-man's foster mother. The last man, who must have stopped for some purpose, was fully a quarter of a mile in rear of the party. He was hurrying to catch up when Tarzan saw him, and as he passed beneath the tree in which the ape-man perched above the trail, a silent noose dropped deftly about his neck. The main body still was in plain sight, and as the frightened man voiced a piercing shriek of terror, they looked back to see his body rise as though by magic straight into the air and disappear amidst the leafy foliage above. For a moment the blacks stood paralyzed by astonishment and fear, but presently the burly sergeant, Usanga, who led them, started back along the trail at a run, calling to the others to follow him. Loading their guns as they came, the blacks ran to succor their fellow, and at Usanga's command they spread into a thin line that presently entirely surrounded the tree into which their comrade had vanished. Usanga called but received no reply. Then he advanced slowly with rifle at the ready, peering up into the tree. He could see no one, nothing. The circle closed in until 50 blacks were searching among the branches with their keen eyes. What had become of their fellow? They had seen him rise into the tree, and since then many eyes had been fastened upon the spot, yet there was no sign of him. One, more venturesome than his fellows, volunteered to climb into the tree and investigate. He was gone but a minute or two, and when he dropped to earth again he swore that there was no sign of a creature there. Perplexed, and by this time a bit awed, the blacks drew slowly away from the spot, and with many backward glances and less laughing continued upon their journey until, when about a mile beyond the spot at which their fellow had disappeared, those in the lead saw him peering from behind a tree at one side of the trail just in front of them. With shouts to their companions that he had been found, they ran forwards, but those who were first to reach the tree stopped suddenly and shrank back, their eyes rolling fearfully first in one direction and then in another, as though they expected some nameless horror to leap out upon them. Nor was their terror without foundation. Impaled upon the end of a broken branch, the head of their companion was propped behind the tree, so that it appeared to be looking out at them from the opposite side of the bole. It was then that many wished to turn back, arguing that they had offended some demon of the wood upon whose preserve they had trespassed, but Usanga refused to listen to them, assuring them that inevitable torture and death awaited them should they return and fall again into the hands of their cruel German masters. At last his reasoning prevailed to the end that a much subdued and terrified band moved in a compact mass, like a drove of sheep, forward through the valley, and there were no stragglers. It is a happy characteristic of the Negro race, which they hold in common with little children, that their spirits seldom remain depressed for a considerable length of time after the immediate cause of depression is removed. And so it was that in half an hour Usanga's band was again beginning to take on to some extent its former appearance of carefree lightheartedness. Thus were the heavy clouds of fear slowly dissipating when a turn in the trail brought them suddenly upon the headless body of their erstwhile companion lying directly in their path, and they were again plunged into the depth of fear and gloomy forebodings. So utterly inexplicable and uncanny had the entire occurrence been that there was not a one of them who could find a ray of comfort penetrating the dead blackness of its ominous portent. What had happened to one of their number each conceived as being a wholly possible fate for himself, in fact quite his probable fate. If such a thing could happen in broad daylight, what frightful thing might not fall to their lot when night had enshrouded them in her mantle of darkness? They trembled in anticipation. The white girl in their midst was no less mystified than they, but far less moved, since sudden death was the most merciful fate to which she might now look forward. So far she had been subjected to nothing worse than the petty cruelties of the women, while on the other hand it had alone been the presence of the women that had saved her from worse treatment at the hands of some of the men, notably the brutal black sergeant Usanga. His own woman was of the party a veritable giantess, a virago of the first magnitude, and she was evidently the only thing in the world of which Usanga stood in awe. Even though she was particularly cruel to the young woman, the latter believed that she was her sole protection from the degraded black tyrant. Late in the afternoon the band came upon a small palisaded village of thatched huts set in a clearing in the jungle close beside a placid river. At their approach the villagers came pouring out, and Usanga advanced with two of his warriors to palaver with the chief. The experiences of the day had so shaken the nerves of the black sergeant that he was ready to treat with these people rather than take their village by force of arms, as would ordinarily have been his preference. But now a vague conviction influenced him that there watched over this part of the jungle a powerful demon who wielded miraculous power for evil against those who offended him. First, Usanga would learn how these villagers stood with this savage god, and if they had his goodwill, Usanga would be most careful to treat them with kindness and respect. At the palaver, it developed that the village chief had food, goats and fowl, which he would be glad to dispose of for a proper consideration, but as the consideration would have meant parting with precious rifles and ammunition, or the very clothing from their backs. Usanga began to see that, after all, it might be forced upon him to wage war to obtain food. A happy solution was arrived at by a suggestion of one of his men that the soldiers go forth the following day and hunt for the villagers, bringing them in so much fresh meat in return for their hospitality. This the chief agreed to, stipulating the kind and quantity of game to be paid in return for flour, goats and fowl, and a certain number of huts that were to be turned over to the visitors. The details having been settled after an hour or more of that bickering argument of which the native African is so fond, the newcomers entered the village, where they were assigned to huts. Bertha Kircher found herself alone in a small hut close to the palisade at the far end of the village street, and though she was neither bound nor guarded, she was assured by Usanga that she could not escape the village without running into almost certain death in the jungle, which the villagers assured them was infested by lions of great size and ferocity. "Be good to Usanga," he concluded, "and no harm will befall you. I will come again to see you after the others are asleep. Let us be friends." As the brute left her, the girl's frame was racked by a convulsive shudder as she sank to the floor of the hut and covered her face with her hands. She realized now why the women had not been left to guard her. It was the work of the cunning Usanga, but would not his woman suspect something of his intentions? She was no fool, and further, being imbued with insane jealousy, she was ever looking for some overt act upon the part of her Ebon lord. Bertha Kircher felt that only she might save her, and that she would save her if word could be but gotten to her. But how? Left alone and away from the eyes of her captors for the first time since the previous night, the girl immediately took advantage of the opportunity to assure herself that the papers she had taken from the body of Hauptmann Fritz Schneider were still safely sewn inside one of her undergarments. Alas, of what value could they now ever be to her beloved country? But habit and loyalty were so strong within her that she still clung to the determined hope of eventually delivering the little packet to her chief. The natives seemed to have forgotten her existence. No one came near the hut, not even to bring her food. She could hear them at the other end of the village laughing and yelling, and knew that they were celebrating with food and native beer, knowledge which only increased her apprehension. To be prisoner in a native village in the very heart of an unexplored region of Central Africa, the only white woman among a band of drunken Negroes. The very thought appalled her. Yet there was a slight promise in the fact that she had so far been unmolested, the promise that they might indeed have forgotten her, and that soon they might become so hopelessly drunk as to be harmless. Darkness had fallen, and still no one came. The girl wondered if she dared venture forth in search of Naratu, Usanga's woman, for Usanga might not forget that he had promised to return. No one was near as she stepped out of the hut and made her way toward the part of the village where the revelers were making merry about a fire. As she approached, she saw the villagers and their guests squatting in a large circle about the blaze, before which a half-dozen naked warriors leapt and bent and stamped in some grotesque dance. Pots of food and gourds of drink were being passed about among the audience. Dirty hands were plunged into the food pots, and the captured portions devoured so greedily that one might have thought the entire community had been upon the point of starvation. The gourds they held to their lips until the beer ran down their chins, and the vessels were wrested from them by greedy neighbors. The drink had now begun to take noticeable effect upon most of them, with the result that they were beginning to give themselves up to utter and licentious abandon. As the girl came nearer, keeping in the shadow of the huts, looking for Naratu, she was suddenly discovered by one upon the edge of the crowd, a huge woman who rose, shrieking, and came toward her. From her aspect, the white girl thought that the woman meant literally to tear her to pieces. So utterly wanton and uncalled for was the attack that it found the girl entirely unprepared, and what would have happened had not a warrior interfered may only be guessed. And then Usanga, noting the interruption, came lurching forward to question her. "What do you want?" he cried. "Food and drink. Come with me," and he threw an arm about her and dragged her toward the circle. "No," she cried, "I want Naratu." "Where is Naratu?" This seemed to sober the black for a moment, as though he had temporarily forgotten his better half. He cast quick, fearful glances about, and then, evidently assured that Naratu had noticed nothing, he ordered the warrior who was still holding the infuriated black woman from the white girl to take the latter back to her hut and to remain there on guard over her. First appropriating a gourd of beer for himself, the warrior motioned the girl to precede him, and thus guarded she returned to her hut, the fellow squatting down just outside the doorway, where he confined his attentions for some time to the gourd. Bertha Kircher sat down at the far side of the hut, awaiting she knew not what impending fate. She could not sleep, so filled was her mind with wild schemes of escape, though each new one must always be discarded as impractical. Half an hour after the warrior had returned her to her prison, he rose and entered the hut, where he tried to engage in conversation with her. Groping across the interior, he leaned his short spear against the wall and sat down beside her, and as he talked he edged closer and closer until at last he could reach out and touch her. Shrinking, she drew away. "Do not touch me," she cried. "I will tell Usanga if you do not leave me alone, and you know what he will do to you." The man only laughed drunkenly, and reaching out his hand, grabbed her arm and dragged her toward him. She fought and cried aloud for Usanga, and at the same instant the entrance to the hut was darkened by the form of a man. "What is the matter?" shouted the newcomer in the deep tones that the girl recognized as belonging to the black sergeant. He had come, but would she be any better off? She knew that she would not unless she could play upon Usanga's fear of his woman. When Usanga found what had happened, he kicked the warrior out of the hut and bade him begone, and when the fellow had disappeared, muttering and grumbling, the sergeant approached the white girl. He was very drunk, so drunk that several times she succeeded in eluding him, and twice she pushed him so violently away that he stumbled and fell. Finally he became enraged and, rushing upon her, seized her in his long, ape-like arms. Striking at his face with clenched fists, she tried to protect herself and drive him away. She threatened him with the wrath of Naratu, and at that he changed his tactics and began to plead, and as he argued with her, promising her safety and eventual freedom, the warrior he had kicked out of the hut made his staggering way to the hut occupied by Naratu. Usanga, finding that pleas and promises were as unavailing as threats, at last lost both his patience and his head, seizing the girl roughly, and simultaneously there burst into the hut a raging demon of jealousy. Naratu had come. Kicking, scratching, striking, biting, she routed the terrified Usanga in short order, and so obsessed was she by her desire to inflict punishment upon her unfaithful lord and master that she quite forgot the object of his infatuation. Bertha Kircher heard her screaming down the village street at Usanga's heels and trembled at the thought of what lay in store for her at the hands of these two. For she knew that tomorrow at the latest Naratu would take out upon her the full measure of her jealous hatred after she had spent her first wrath upon Usanga. The two had departed but a few minutes when the warrior guard returned. He looked into the hut and then entered. "No one will stop me now, white woman," he growled as he stepped quickly across the hut toward her. Tarzan of the apes, feasting well upon a juicy haunch from Bara, the deer, was vaguely conscious of a troubled mind. He should have been at peace with himself and all the world, for was he not in his native element, surrounded by game in plenty, and rapidly filling his belly with the flesh he loved best? But Tarzan of the apes was haunted by the picture of a slight, young girl being shoved and struck by brutal negresses, and in imagination could see her now camped in this savage country, a prisoner among degraded blacks. Why was it so difficult to remember that she was only a hated German and a spy? Why would the fact that she was a woman and white always obtrude itself upon his consciousness? He hated her as he hated all her kind, and the fate that was sure to be hers was no more terrible than she in common with all her people deserved. The matter was settled, and Tarzan composed himself to think of other things, yet the picture would not die. It rose in all its details and annoyed him. He began to wonder what they were doing to her and where they were taking her. He was very much ashamed of himself, as he had been after the episode in Wilhelmstal, when his weakness had permitted him to spare this spy's life. Was he to be thus weak again? No. Night came, and he settled himself in an ample tree to rest until morning, but sleep would not come. Instead came the vision of a white girl being beaten by black women, and again of the same girl at the mercy of the warriors somewhere in that dark and forbidding jungle. With a growl of anger and self-contempt, Tarzan arose, shook himself, and swung from his tree to that adjoining, and thus through the lower terraces. He followed the trail that Usanga's party had taken earlier in the afternoon. He had little difficulty, as the band had followed a well-beaten path, and when toward midnight the stench of a native village assailed his delicate nostrils, he guessed that his goal was near, and that presently he should find her whom he sought. Prowling stealthily as prowls Numa, the lion, stalking a wary prey, Tarzan moved noiselessly about the palisade, listening and sniffing. At the rear of the village he discovered a tree whose branches extended over the top of the palisade, and a moment later he had dropped quietly into the village. From hut to hut he went searching with keen ears and nostrils, some confirming evidence of the presence of the girl, and at last, faint and almost obliterated by the odor of the gomangani, he found it hanging like a delicate vapor about a small hut. The village was quiet now, for the last of the beer and the food had been disposed of, and the blacks lay in their huts overcome by stupor. Yet Tarzan made no noise that even a sober man keenly alert might have heard. He passed around to the entrance of the hut and listened. From within came no sound, not even the low breathing of one awake, yet he was sure that the girl had been here and perhaps was even now, and so he entered, slipping in as silently as a disembodied spirit. For a moment he stood motionless just within the entranceway, listening. No, there was no one here, of that he was sure, but he would investigate. As his eyes became accustomed to the greater darkness within the hut, an object began to take form that presently outlined itself in a human form supine upon the floor. Tarzan stepped closer and leaned over to examine it. It was the dead body of a naked warrior from whose chest protruded a short spear. Then he searched carefully every square foot of the remaining floor space and at last returned to the body again, where he stooped and smelled of the haft of the weapon that had slain the black. A slow smile touched his lips and a slight movement of his head betokened that he understood. A rapid search of the balance of the village assured him that the girl had escaped, and a feeling of relief came over him that no harm had befallen her. That her life was equally in jeopardy in the savage jungle to which she must have flown did not impress him as it would have you or me, since to Tarzan the jungle was not a dangerous place. He considered one safer there than in Paris or London by night. He had entered the trees again and was outside the palisade when there came faintly to his ears from far beyond the village an old, familiar sound. Balancing lightly upon a swaying branch he stood, a graceful statue of a forest god, listening intently. For a minute he stood thus, and then there broke from his lips the long, weird cry of ape calling to ape, and he was away through the jungle toward the sound of the booming drum of the anthropoids, leaving behind him an awakened and terrified village of cringing blacks, who would forever after connect that eerie cry with the disappearance of their white prisoner and the death of their fellow warrior. Bertha Kircher, hurrying through the jungle along a well-beaten game trail, thought only of putting as much distance as possible between herself and the village before daylight could permit pursuit of her. Whither she was going she did not know, nor was it a matter of great moment, since death must be her lot sooner or later. Fortune favored her that night, for she passed unscathed through as savage and lion-ridden an area as there is in all Africa, a natural hunting ground which the white man has not yet discovered, where deer and antelope and zebra, giraffe and elephant, buffalo, rhinoceros, and the other herbivorous animals of Central Africa abound unmolested by none but their natural enemies, the great cats which, lured here by easy prey and immunity from the rifles of big-game hunters, swarmed the district. She had fled for an hour or two, perhaps, when her attention was arrested by the sound of animals moving about, muttering and growling close ahead. Assured that she had covered a sufficient distance to ensure her a good start in the morning before the blacks could take to her trail, and fearful of what the creatures might be, she climbed into a large tree with the intention of spending the balance of the night there. She had no sooner reached a safe and comfortable branch when she discovered that the tree stood upon the edge of a small clearing that had been hidden from her by the heavy undergrowth upon the ground below, and simultaneously she discovered the identity of the beasts she had heard. In the center of the clearing below her, clearly visible in the bright moonlight, she saw fully 20 huge man-like apes, great, shaggy fellows who went upon their hind feet with only slight assistance from the knuckles of their hands. The moonlight glanced from their glossy coats, the numerous gray-tipped hairs imparting a sheen that made the hideous creatures almost magnificent in their appearance. The girl had watched them but a minute or two when the little band was joined by others, coming singly and in groups until there were fully 50 of the great brutes gathered there in the moonlight. Among them were young apes and several little ones clinging tightly to their mother's shaggy shoulders. Presently the group parted to form a circle about what appeared to be a small, flat-topped mound of earth in the center of the clearing. Squatting close about this mound were 3 old females armed with short, heavy clubs with which they presently began to pound upon the flat top of the earth mound, which gave forth a dull, booming sound, and almost immediately the other apes commenced to move about restlessly, weaving in and out aimlessly until they carried the impression of a moving mass of great black maggots. The beating of the drum was in a slow, ponderous cadence, at first without time, but presently settling into a heavy rhythm to which the apes kept time with measured tread and swaying bodies. Slowly the mass separated into two rings, the outer of which was composed of she-as and the very young, the inner of mature bulls. The former ceased to move and squatted upon their haunches, while the bulls now moved slowly about in a circle, the center of which was the drum, and all now in the same direction. It was then that there came faintly to the ears of the girl from the direction of the village she had recently quitted a weird and high-pitched cry. The effect upon the apes was electrical. They stopped their movements and stood in attitudes of intent, listening for a moment, and then one fellow, huger than his companions, raised his face to the heavens and in a voice that sent the cold shudders through the girl's slight frame answered the far-off cry. Once again the beaters took up their drumming and the slow dance went on. There was a certain fascination in the savage ceremony that held the girl spellbound, and as there seemed little likelihood of her being discovered, she felt that she might as well remain the balance of the night in her tree and resume her flight by the comparatively greater safety of daylight. Assuring herself that her packet of papers was safe, she sought as comfortable a position as possible among the branches and settled herself to watch the weird proceedings in the clearing below her. A half-hour passed, during which the cadence of the drum increased gradually. Now the great bull that had replied to the distant call leapt from the inner circle to dance alone between the drummers and the other bulls. He leaped and crouched and leaped again, now growling and barking, again stopping to raise his hideous face to Goro, the moon, and beating upon his shaggy breast, uttered a piercing scream, the challenge of the bull ape, had the girl but known it. He stood thus in the full glare of the great moon, motionless after screaming forth his weird challenge. In the setting of the primeval jungle, and the circling apes a picture of primitive savagery and power, a mightily muscled Hercules out of the dawn of life, when from close behind her the girl heard an answering scream. And an instant later saw an almost naked white man drop from a nearby tree into the clearing. Instantly the apes became a roaring, snarling pack of angry beasts. Bertha Kircher held her breath. What maniac was this who dared approach these frightful creatures in their own haunts, alone against 50? She saw the brown-skinned figure bathed in moonlight walk straight toward the snarling pack. She saw the symmetry and the beauty of that perfect body, its grace, its strength, its wondrous proportioning, and then she recognized him. It was the same creature whom she had seen carry Major Schneider from General Kraut's headquarters, the same who had rescued her from Numa, the lion, the same whom she had struck down with the butt of her pistol and escaped when he would have returned her to her enemies. The same who had slain Hauptmann Fritz Schneider and spared her life that night in Wilhelmsthal. Fear-filled and fascinated, she watched him as he neared the apes. She heard sounds issue from his throat, sounds identical with those uttered by the apes, and though she could scarce believe the testimony of her own ears, she knew that this godlike creature was conversing with the brutes in their own tongue. Tarzan halted just before he reached the sheaves of the outer circle. "I am Tarzan of the apes," he cried. "You do not know me because I am of another tribe, but Tarzan comes in peace or he comes to fight. Which shall it be? Tarzan will talk with your king." And so saying, he pushed straight forward through the sheaves and the young, who now gave way before him, making a narrow lane through which he passed toward the inner circle. Shiz and Ballas growled and bristled as he passed closer, but none hindered him, and thus he came to the inner circle of bulls. Here bared fangs menaced him and growling faces hideously contorted. "I am Tarzan," he repeated. "Tarzan comes to dance the dum-dum with his brothers. Where is your king?" Again he pressed forward, and the girl in the tree clapped her palms to her cheeks as she watched, wide-eyed, this madman going to a frightful death. In another instant they would be upon him, rending and tearing until that perfect form had been ripped to shreds, but again the ring parted, and though the apes roared and menaced him, they did not attack, and at last he stood in the inner circle close to the drum and faced the great king ape. Again he spoke. "I am Tarzan of the apes," he cried. "Tarzan comes to live with his brothers. He will come in peace and live in peace, or he will kill, but he has come and he will stay. Which shall Tarzan dance the dum-dum in peace with his brothers, or shall Tarzan kill first?" "I am Go Lat, king of the apes," screamed the great bull. "I kill, I kill, I kill." And with a sullen roar he charged the Tarmangani. The ape-man, as the girl watched him, seemed entirely unprepared for the charge, and she looked to see him borne down and slain at the first rush. The great bull was almost upon him with huge hands outstretched to seize him before Tarzan made a move, but when he did move, his quickness would have put Ara, the lightning, to shame. As darts forward the head of Hista, the snake, so darted forward the left hand of the man-beast as he seized the left wrist of his antagonist. A quick turn and the bull's right arm was locked beneath the right arm of his foe in a jujutsu hold that Tarzan had learned among civilized men, a hold with which he might easily break the great bones, a hold that left the ape helpless. "I am Tarzan of the apes," screamed the ape-man. "Shall Tarzan dance in peace, or shall Tarzan kill? I kill. I kill. I kill," shrieked Go-Lat. With the quickness of a cat, Tarzan swung the king ape over one hip and sent him sprawling to the ground. "I am Tarzan, king of all the apes," he shouted. "Shall it be peace?" Go-Lat, infuriated, leapt to his feet and charged again, shouting his war cry, "I kill, I kill, I kill." And again Tarzan met him with a sudden hold that the stupid bull, being ignorant of, could not possibly avert, a hold and a throw that brought a scream of delight from the interested audience and suddenly filled the girl with doubts as to the man's madness. Evidently he was quite safe among the apes, for she saw him swing Go-Lat to his back and then catapult him over his shoulder. The king ape fell upon his head and lay very still. "I am Tarzan of the apes," cried the ape-man. "I come to dance the dum-dum with my brothers," and he made a motion to the drummers, who immediately took up the cadence of the dance where they had dropped it to watch their king slay the foolish Tarmangani. It was then that Go-Lat raised his head and slowly crawled to his feet. Tarzan approached him. "I am Tarzan of the apes," he cried. "Shall Tarzan dance the dum-dum with his brothers now, or shall he kill first?" Go-Lat raised his bloodshot eyes to the face of the Tarmangani. "Kagoda," he cried. "Tarzan of the apes will dance the dum-dum with his brothers and Go-Lat will dance with him." And then the girl in the tree saw the savage man leaping, bending and stamping with the savage apes in the ancient rite of the dum-dum. His roars and growls were more beastly than the beasts'. His handsome face was distorted with savage ferocity. He beat upon his great breast and screamed forth his challenge as his smooth, brown hide brushed the shaggy coats of his fellows. It was weird, it was wonderful, and in its primitive savagery it was not without beauty. The strange scene she looked upon, such a scene as no other human being probably ever had witnessed, and yet withal it was horrible. As she gazed, spellbound, a stealthy movement in the tree behind her caused her to turn her head, and there, back of her, blazing in the reflected moonlight, shone two great, yellow-green eyes. Sheeta, the panther, had found her out. The beast was so close that it might have reached out and touched her with a great taloned paw. There was no time to think, no time to think, no time to weigh chances or to choose alternatives. Terror-inspired impulse was her guide as with a loud scream she leaped from the tree into the clearing. Instantly the apes, now maddened by the effects of the dancing and the moonlight, turned to note the cause of the interruption. They saw this Tarmangani helpless and alone, and they started for her. Sheeta, the panther, knowing that not even Numa, the lion, unless maddened by starvation, dares meddle with the great apes at their dum-dum, had silently vanished into the night, seeking his supper elsewhere. Tarzan, turning with the other apes toward the cause of the interruption, saw the girl, recognized her and also her peril. Here again might she die at the hands of others, but why consider it? He knew that he could not permit it, and though the acknowledgement shamed him, it had to be admitted. The leading Shias were almost upon the girl when Tarzan leaped among them, and with heavy blows scattered them to right and left, and then as the bulls came to share in the kill, they thought this new ape thing was about to make that he might steal all the flesh for himself. They found him facing them with an arm thrown about the creature as though to protect her. "This is Tarzan's she," he said. "Do not harm her." It was the only way he could make them understand that they must not slay her. He was glad that she could not interpret the words. It was humiliating enough to make such a statement to wild apes about this hated enemy. So once again Tarzan of the apes was forced to protect a Hun. Growling, he muttered to himself in extenuation, "She is a woman and I am not a German, so it could not be otherwise."